Let's turn our attention overseas now. Another controversial political figure of the past has died. The first Prime Minister of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, has succumbed to severe pneumonia at the age of 91. In more than 3 decades at the helm of the city-state, Mr Lee turned Singapore from a post-colonial backwater into an economic powerhouse. But at what cost? Personal freedoms, including freedoms of speech, were sacrificed in the name of public order and prosperity.
I've spent a whole lifetime building this. And as long as I'm in charge, nobody's going to knock it down. And even from my sick bed, even if you are going to lower me into the grave and I feel that something is going wrong, I'll get up.
Joining us now to talk about the life and legacy of Lee Kuan Yew and what his death might mean for Singapore and the wider region, Michael Barr, author of The Ruling Elite of Singapore and Associate Professor at Flinders University. Michael Barr, welcome to The Drum.
Thank you, John.
In your view, just how much of, everyone talks about it, the economic miracle that Lee Kuan Yew enacted in Singapore, this tiny state became such a powerhouse. How much of a miracle was it and how did he achieve it?
It was a formidable achievement, there's no question about that. Singapore's neighbours weren't able to achieve anything like that in the same sort of time frame, and if you look at Singapore in the 1980s, it had just left its neighbours behind. It achieved it effectively by sucking into itself the full benefit of being in one of the most strategic places in the world. Singapore sits at the southern end of the Straits of Malacca, through which most of the world's container traffic flows. It is the second most busy through point for oil in the world, and he was very successful in capitalising on that. And not he and his government and his colleagues. Lee was no real economist himself, but he was a strategic thinker, and he knew to take good advice and who to take it from. And, you know, he built up the Port of Singapore, Changi Airport, Singapore Airlines. These were critical investments, and he made full use of them.
What price was paid for the prosperity that many Singaporeans came to enjoy? The clean streets, the laws against spitting and chewing gum, can't throw rubbish off your balcony, all these kinds of things. And then, of course, the lack of freedom of speech and the fact that it was essentially one-party rule for a very long time.
Well, it's almost one family rule, isn't it? The inhibition of freedom of speech goes to the point of the detention of people who have never been charged. And some of my friends, they're friends now, spent time in jail and were, in some cases, tortured, beaten. And this is something that Singaporeans were asked to accept. And I think in the early days there was a sense, like in the 1970s, that was the worst time. There was a sense that these are some of the sacrifices that you have to make to succeed, because Singapore was at a make or break situation, especially after it left Malaysia. By the time you get to the 1970s, which was the last big round of detentions, those days had gone, and by then people thought that the country should be able to do something better. And that, I believe, is where Lee Kuan Yew's legacy starts to deteriorate in the 1980s, where a lot of the work he had done to build up Singapore pushed into private projects about the Chinese being on top and taking control and creating an upper class of upper middle class Chinese.
To what extent would you say, Michael Barr, that Singapore is a unique nation with a unique set of circumstances? Or, I mean, some would draw parallels perhaps between Singapore's path and other developing nations in Asia, to an extent China, South Korea as well. You accept a level of authoritarian government in return for prosperity, and that this is maybe better than what we in the West might term as an acceptable democratic model.
That argument may have had some currency in times like the 1960s and the 1970s, although I note that Japan never needed to go down that path. They didn't have anything like what we would consider a freewheeling democracy either in the 1960s and the 1970s, and yet it certainly was not authoritarian, so it wasn't necessary. the problem, I think, can be seen when you see the fact that this authoritarianism continues and even intensifies after the building up has already happened and the achievements are on the board. And then you start to wonder, was it just for the sake of building up the country for economic development, or was it in part at least a very convenient way of taking power to yourself and to your clique?
John, what I'm interested in with Lee Kuan Yew is it wasn't just a brutal capitalist country. He also had very strong social programs in terms of housing. They've got a very good health service. I think I'm right in saying about half the cost per capita of ours, and of course remarkable achievements in education. This, I think, don't you think, balances out, I think, some of the criticism we might have against the anti-democratic nature of the country?
We need to fully acknowledge the achievements. There's no question about that. I've done a lot of work, for instance, on both the health and the education system, less so on the housing system. And you do have to take some of those achievements with a certain amount of caution. Singapore does not use international standards in measuring the cost of its health system, for instance. And yet, let's be upfront. The health system and the education system have had their achievements, and they are world class. And Singapore, particularly in the sciences and in maths, really is the top of world class. The problem is that part of the problem is that a lot of those achievements also contain the seeds of the problems that this generation is facing, because so much of their achievements was from a rigid and elitist education system. And a lot of it is from, especially in the old days, from rote learning. And you get an entire education system and a whole social system and a media system based upon conformity. And it does make it difficult to then turn around and build a new economy which needs to be based upon creativity.
Well, Michael Barr, we appreciate your expertise and you taking the time to talk to us on The Drum. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And